Perfectionism anxiety almost destroyed my life. And if you are someone who suffers from perfectionism, you know exactly what it's like to be stuck in the perfectionistic trap. It's hell, quite frankly. And we're here today to talk about how to overcome perfectionism and how to create a life where you can still succeed, you can still do the things you want, just without being constantly anxious and depressed and never feeling like you're enough. Hello, my name is Kimberley Quinlan. I'm a marriage and family therapist. I'm an anxiety specialist, and I personally have walked the walk of perfectionism and have had to overcome it as it was starting to severely impact my life. So I am so excited to be here with you today to talk all about perfectionism and perfectionism anxiety. Now, I am 15 years recovered from an eating disorder. I was personally completely overwhelmed with perfectionism anxiety, and I was in a perfectionism trap. So let's talk about it. First, let me give you a little bit of a personal update or background. Is when I went off to college, I was really naive. I was wise and smart, but I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I had lived home with my family on a rural farm, on a ranch, if you live in America, for my entire life. And then I went off to what was considered the big city to college, and I felt like I had to be perfect. I had this belief as soon as I left my family that if I could be perfect, I would be safe. I would be emotionally safe. I would be physically safe. And as long as I could keep everything perfect, nothing bad would happen. I also believe that if I could be perfect, people would not abandon me or disapprove of me or judge me. And so I went out of my way to make sure everything was as perfect as I could make it, even though I understood that I wasn't perfect. I was on a mission to try and get to the top of that hill and stay at the top of that hill. And it was a protective measure, a safety behavior I engaged in to manage the anxiety and overwhelm I felt going off to college. I also believed that if I could stay perfect, it would protect me from really uncomfortable emotions like shame and guilt, and it would help me feel like I'm in control. I would try to give me a full sense of control in a world where I felt very out of control. Now, a big part of this was me understanding what we call the perfectionism trap. The perfectionism trap is, yes, when you start perfecting yourself and perfecting your life, you start to get praise from people around you. You start to get rewarded for your perfectionistic behaviors. My grades started to improve because I was being perfectionistic. My bosses gave me extra shifts because I was so good at my job. But the problem with that is, as I was getting better and trying to perfect everything in my life and please all of the people, I started to feel overwhelmed with all that I had taken on. In addition to that, once I had gotten to this quote unquote perfect place, which again, I totally understood that I wasn't perfect, but as I started to climb that mountain and get to the peak and start to have the relief of anxiety that I made it, I'm at the top, I'm doing really well, then I started to have the influx of anxiety. What if I can't maintain this? What happens if I make a mistake and fall off this perfectionism mountain that I have climbed? And then I was constantly anxious and constantly feeling hopeless about the fact that I can't maintain staying at this high level for as long as I was. This is the perfectionistic trap. The more you try to become perfect, the more pressure and stress and anxiety you feel, the more hopeless you feel about being able to maintain that, the more depressed you feel that you're stuck in this cycle. And all of a sudden, nothing is worth it. Often people completely fall down. They can't go on in this way. They burn out. They get sick, which happened to me. Or they become so paralyzed with anxiety that they have to avoid things and start telling little white lies just to get through the day because they've built up this idea of being perfect on the people around them. If you're experiencing this, you're not alone. Please do not feel bad about this. This is a common experience, particularly if you're someone who's set up for anxiety. Now I've gone through a lot of the symptoms, but let's go through some additional perfectionism anxiety symptoms or signs. The first one is people with perfectionism have a severe fear of failure. They're overwhelmed by the idea that they might mess up, they might make a mistake. And when they do make a mistake, they see it as a failure, not a blip on the road, not a challenge that they will learn from, but it's that they are a failure, that their mistake and their failure means that that person is, in fact, their identity is a failure. And that can be incredibly emotionally painful. Another perfectionism anxiety symptom is shame and vulnerability. There is so much shame around making mistakes or being seen as vulnerable or weak or not perfect or not keeping up with the Joneses. And that can be so emotionally painful that that's what propels them into continuing perfectionistic behaviors, pushing themselves harder than they can maintain, putting them or raising their hands in situations that they really honestly shouldn't be saying yes to. That they don't even have the capacity for what they've already signed up for. You may know the quote that says, if you want something done, find the busiest person. That's commonly the perfectionist, because they're the ones who can get jobs done and they're willing to put their own mental and physical wellness aside to get the job done. Another sign of perfectionism often shows up at work. When you have perfectionism anxiety, work can become very frustrating or depressing. And this is often, again, because of the expectations you've put on yourself. You associate work as being an incredibly stressful environment because as you walk into work, you're bringing in these expectations. You're bringing this goal of being perfect, not making mistakes, and that can create an incredible amount of anxiety and distress. It also creates, as I said, a lot of depression or hopelessness or helplessness, because often people with perfectionism are suffering in silence. They don't feel like they can share to other people how much they're suffering. All this succeeding, they make it look maybe even so easy, but underneath they're really struggling and they don't want people to find out. They feel like that would be letting other people in on the lie that you're actually not this person that you're perceived to be. Another really important sign is this ongoing fear or belief that I'll never be good enough, right? This deep down belief that you don't have the worth just being who you are, that you have to show up being more and more and more in order to be respected, to be loved, to be accepted by people. And that can be incredibly stressful. A big overlap is between perfectionism and procrastination. Again, as I said, when you raise the bar so high, often the only thing that people can do is to avoid the thing because they're overwhelmed at the prospects of making a mistake. They're overwhelmed at the expectation they've put on themselves. They go into a freeze mode where they can't even move forward. It's too overwhelming. Their nervous system is shutting down. They're having increased heart rate, tightness in the chest, nausea, stomach issues, muscle aches, headaches, migraines. And so because of that, they just procrastinate and keep pushing the deadline away. Often when I see someone, they have been told they're not perfectionistic because they've procrastinated and avoided so long. And they have been told they're not perfectionistic because they've procrastinated and avoided so long. A professional or a doctor has said, no, that you can't be perfectionistic because you're not getting anything done. But often those who are avoiding are more perfectionistic than the people who they know out succeeding. It's the heavy layer of expectation that causes them to stall and avoid moving forward in any way. Now, when you suffer from perfectionist anxiety, relationships can also become really strained. Really common in perfectionism is people pleasing, or the fear that you have let people down. You spend a lot of time worrying about what they think of you. In addition to that, it's not just worrying what they think of you. Often people with perfectionism become highly judgmental of their loved ones or their friends or their children or their partner. They may also become easily annoyed when other people can't maintain that perfectionism. Often in relationships, if there's a person with perfectionism and their partner is struggling, the person with perfectionism gets quite frustrated because in their mind, they're like, just be perfect, like get it fixed, fix it. I'm doing all the perfectionistic behaviors. Why can't you? And that can cause an incredible amount of strain on the relationship. They also might experience a degree of anger, frustration, irritability. And that's not because they're horrible people. It's because they've raised the bar and the expectations so high to be perfect that even if their loved ones are struggling, by association, they feel like that's jeopardizing their perfectionism. And this is a really common thing that comes into couples counseling. Once they get there, the relationship has been so strained without identifying that perfectionism could be a massive driver behind their relationship issues. Now, there is something to note here is there is no such thing as a perfectionism anxiety disorder. A lot of people are searching for those terms to see if this is in fact a disorder. But there are common disorders such as eating disorders, generalized anxiety disorder, and OCD that do co-occur with perfectionism. Now, there are specific types of OCD, one of them being perfectionism OCD. That is a specific subtype of OCD where the underlying force towards the compulsion is perfectionism, and it's often coming from a place of anxiety and uncertainty. Usually with people with perfectionism OCD, they're not doing their compulsions or safety behaviors from a place of wanting to. They usually feel like they can't stop doing them. They feel like they're stuck in a loop of doing these behaviors even though they don't want to. And this is very common alongside other subtypes like just right OCD, symmetry OCD, and moral and religious OCD as well. Now, often people do ask, let's weigh it up. Perfectionism versus perfectionism OCD. How do we know the difference? Well, a thing to remember here is that often perfectionism is what we call egocentric, meaning it's in line with their values. They want to be perfect. It's a driving force to be perfect. It actually reduces their discomfort by moving in that direction. For those with perfectionism OCD, it's actually ego dystonic, which means they don't want this obsession. It's intrusive, it's repetitive. They really don't believe that the point of the perfectionism, but they feel compelled to engage in this behavior and they feel like they can't stop engaging in this behavior. Now, I want to really slow down here because that's not always true for everybody. I've often seen where clients will have a combination of the two, or maybe on a spectrum, they might be more closer to the perfectionism OCD end, but they do still have some egocentric perfectionism that's showing up. So I want to make sure that if you're having these perfectionism symptoms, go to a mental health professional so you can work out specifically what's true for you. So that's an important point to make here is please don't misdiagnose yourself here. These perfectionism can also show up in PTSD. It can show up in depression. It can show up in other disorders as well. So I want us to use this as information, but please do not use this as a way to diagnose yourself. Now, if you do have perfectionism OCD, there is specific OCD treatment that is helpful for that. For those of you with perfectionism, I'm actually going to go through that right here in a second. But first, let's just address that OCD treatment usually will involve a type of cognitive behavioral therapy called ERP, exposure and response prevention. Now, in this case, we actually expose you to being imperfect on purpose. We have you practice reducing your safety behaviors and compulsions around perfectionism so that you can practice riding the wave of discomfort or uncertainty or anxiety and learn that by riding that wave, you can actually tolerate that discomfort and move on without engaging in behaviors that make your life more stressful. It often involves saying no. It often involves slowing down. It often involves, again, being imperfect on purpose. But now let's move over to how you can stop being a perfectionist and how you can overcome perfectionism if that is in fact what you're dealing with. I, again, want to share with you, I get how painful this is. I worked through this for close to a decade, and I still see it come up. I still see it show up in my life where I have to catch it. And it kind of shows up in a way that's sneaky, and it feels, my experience is it's a powerful feeling when you're engaging in perfectionism. But I also notice that when I'm starting to feel really burnt out and really overwhelmed and my anxiety and depression are going up, it's usually because I've allowed that sneaky perfectionism to get into my life more than I would have wanted to. So when we're talking about overcoming perfectionism, here are a few things that were really helpful for me. Number one is identify the ways that perfectionism is keeping me trapped. For me, when I had an eating disorder and a lot of perfectionism, I actually had to do a deep study on how it was impacting my life. Because as my therapist was trying to get me to change these behaviors, I was showing up with a lot of restriction and a lot of like resistance. I did not want to stop. I said to her, like, I'm not ready to get rid of these behaviors. They keep me safe. They keep me feeling like I'm in control. I don't want to feel out of control. I don't want to feel imperfect. I don't want to feel shame. I don't want to feel vulnerable. I don't want to take these behaviors away. But as I looked at how they were impacting my life, I then started to realize how they're actually keeping me trapped and holding me back. The second piece was I had to then do a deep exploration and look at how society had encouraged me to maintain my perfectionism. I had people all around me cheering me on. Good job. Keep going. You're so thin. Look at you thrive. You're so successful. I can't believe how you do it. I'm so impressed. You inspire me. I was constantly fed reinforcement that kept me trapped in perfectionism and made me want to stay in perfectionism, but kept me anxious, kept me feeling like I was a complete fraud, kept me feeling like I was an imposter who, if anyone would ever find out that I'm actually this imperfect, terrible, hopeless human being with no worth, I couldn't bear the idea of that, right? And so I really had to look at how society had fed me into this system as a woman, but also as a human being and as a young person, how this had kept me stuck, right? And how it was going to keep keeping me stuck if I didn't start to change some things. Now, the next thing I had to do is really look and determine how I wanted to live my life. And that was really influenced by my personal values. What was important to me? Is my uncle's opinion of me or my co-worker's opinion of me more important than my own opinion of me? I used to first say yes, but with practice and really looking at it, I started to realize I'm going to die with everyone thinking I was perfect, and I'm going to have died miserable. I wouldn't have done the things I wanted to do. I was living a life based on what other people thought of me and living a life basically hiding from all of my feelings, which brings me to the next big point of my recovery. And if I could say one thing was the most important in my recovery, it will be this, is I had to learn how to feel my feelings. And I had to be willing to write out some really uncomfortable feelings that I had about myself. I had to write out shame, and still do. I had to write out feelings of being worthless, and still do. They still show up. And when they do, I instinctually go to run away from them. And then I have to slow myself down and say, Kimberly, just stay. Be here with it. Running from this emotion or patching it up or making it look pretty is only going to keep you trapped and create a life where you're more and more and more anxious, right? I also had to develop a very strong self-compassion practice, but that actually came last for me. I'm really doing my best with my patients and with you here today to have that be a beginning part of your recovery. But for me, I refused it. I hated the idea and I didn't want to do it. I felt it was weak and I actually thought it would override my perfectionism and make me into some kind of weak loser who can't control their life and is a complete, like, all these words like, I'll be a failure, I won't be successful, it'll make me lazy. I had a whole belief about what self-compassion would do to me, right? But with time, I did start to see the benefit of it. And again, it's something I still have to work on. I had to also recognize that this was a lifelong practice. I do remember, and I will share a story with you, that early in my perfectionism treatment, I actually stopped treatment. I told them, I'm fine, I'm doing great, I don't need you anymore. And off I went. And a part of that was me because I think I was really afraid to do the next level of work. But I think another part of me truly thought that that was all it took. But then as I struggled with different stresses in my life, or as it continued to show up in my relationships and at my work, I realized this is a lifelong practice. This is something I'm going to need to practice for some time. Now, before I finish up with you, I want to share with you some beliefs that I had to adopt to help me overcome perfectionism. And I had to remember these every step of the way. Now, I was really lucky. I had a therapist who would reinforce this with me every single week, but maybe you don't. And so I wanted to just be here to share them with you just in case they're helpful with you managing your own perfectionism. So here they are. The first belief I had to adopt is it's okay to make mistakes, right? It's human to make mistakes. I also had to reframe what a mistake meant. As I said before, a mistake didn't make me a failure anymore. Instead, a mistake was data to help me learn and challenge this problem I was having, right? And now I've done my best. I've even done episodes on your anxiety toolkit talking about how I went out and purposely made mistakes 100 times in less than a year because I still realized I had to challenge this idea that getting a no or getting rejected or making a mistake is a problem, right? Another thing I had to adopt is it's okay if people do not understand me or like me. And this one still breaks my heart. I'm not going to lie. It's still really, really hard for me. But it is important to recognize that most of the time you can be imperfect and people will still make space for you. It is okay to not be perfect. In fact, I have learned the more perfect I tried to be, the more disconnected I was with people. The more perfect I tried to be, the more I sabotaged relationships. I made other people feel judged and uncomfortable. I made it feel unsafe for them to be imperfect, therefore impacting our ability to be vulnerable and in deep connection with each other. So by being imperfect, I actually learned that the real relationships started to show up, that I could be vulnerable and then they would be vulnerable and I would feel seen and they would feel seen and then I would feel worthy and they would feel worthy. And it healed itself in that respect through the relationships, through showing up imperfectly in relationships and letting them see that I'm actually struggling. I'm actually really having a hard time, right? I remember talking to my therapist and saying, like, nobody would know. Nobody would know that I'm having such a hard time. But when I actually started sharing, other people started sharing. And I realized that I didn't have to be perfect because nobody was getting through this life without going through their own struggles and challenges, right? Another really important thing I had to adopt is that my worth is not related to my output. And this is one I still have to remind myself that I do not deserve self-care and kindness just because I kicked butt and work today. That I'm allowed to have compassion and self-care and pleasure, whether I was successful or made money or achieved the things on my to-do list, that I'm always deserving of self-care and pleasure. That is something innate inside of me and that I can use at any time if my body needs. And then the last thing I had to adopt was truly listen to your body. Stop pushing through discomfort in a way where you know that you're pushing your body too hard. too fast. I would say yes to everything, even if my body was exhausted. And I had to learn to listen to my body and listen to when my body was gently nudging me, saying, stop, I'm tired, I need a rest. And that is still something I'm working on, and something that I'll always have to be working on as I age and as my limitations change as well. So that's the things I want you to adopt to help you overcome depression. Now, you may have some other things that you need to adopt as well, and that's okay. I want you to make this as personalized as possible. But I do hope that this number one validated you and your perfectionism anxiety. I hope that it informed you of ways that it shows up for people. And third, I hope it gives you some inspiration that you too can overcome perfectionism anxiety and depression, and hopefully go on to live a very fulfilling life. Have a wonderful day, everybody. And always remember, it is a beautiful day to do hard things.